welcome to Conversations After the Fires. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lori Dajose, and I am a science writer at Caltech. We know that many of you are in various states of displacement, cleaning your homes, rebuilding, or finding new homes, and it's a difficult time. We hope the information that the speakers share today can help you make informed decisions about what to do next and how to advocate for yourself and your neighbors. Without further ado, I'll briefly introduce each of our panelists. Francois Tissot is a professor of geochemistry at Caltech and an Altadena resident. His expertise is in studying the chemical signatures of elements like lead and uranium in meteorites to learn about the early solar system, and he's applying these methods to samples from the Eden Fire. Merritt McDowell is a first-year graduate student in Francois' lab, studying planetary science with a background in chemistry. Isaac Aguilar is also a first-year PhD student at Caltech in the lab of Julia Tejada, assistant professor of geobiology. They bring a background in ecology and remote sensing. Finally, Christine O'Connell joins us from Chapman University, where she is an assistant professor of biological sciences, and she is a Pasadena resident. Christine focuses on how climate change and ecological disturbances like fires and flooding are altering processes on Earth, particularly in soils. So before we dive into your research results, I'd like to ask if anyone wants to say a little bit about why you dropped everything and turned your focus to studying the fires, and what motivated you, and why are you focusing on lead specifically?
Yeah, I can maybe jump in here. So the very unusual nature of the fire, the Eden Fire, with many structures containing lead because they were built so early before the 1970s, means that there is very little guidance. The guidebook that has been used for typical fire does not quite apply. And so given the risk that lead represents for health, especially for young children, the CDC tells you that there is no safe level of lead for children. We have a deep need for data. And so we see the work we're doing as a public service to try to bring clarity to the community and try to help moving forward.
Yeah, I'll echo everything that Francois said, and I'll also chime in that I think, like a lot of you watching this webinar, I had a deeply personal reason for being interested in that work. I know, like other panelists as well. So I live in North Pasadena. I have a toddler daughter and a very beloved dog. And basically, I got started on this project because during those initial 48 hours of being displaced, I wrote to a bunch of soil scientist friends to ask what I thought would have been maybe a simple question, which is, can my daughter play in the backyard again? And can we eat the food in our garden this year and next year? And that kind of led down this rabbit hole of realizing, just as Francois said, maybe we know some things about that after some fires, but this fire probably has some major distinctions from those other wildland urban interface fires. And yeah, it kind of became this enormous thing where I wanted to answer that question for my own family, but also for the tens of thousands of families who are also either living in the fire zone or in the smoke plume downwind.
I'll go ahead and share next. So personally, I grew up in San Diego County where wildfires were also a frequent concern. And I clearly remember two fires that occurred near my childhood home and the anxiety from having to evacuate in the middle of the night. And so these are experiences that kind of motivated me to understand the effects of fire. And I even studied forest management practices during my undergrad at UC Berkeley. So when the Eden Fire happened, I really wanted to help with the response efforts to understand the environmental impacts. And by focusing on lead specifically, I think that I hope to address community concerns in addition to tracking some of the ecological impacts of lead in the environment.
Yeah, so just to round us out, I think echoing what everyone else has said already, but I personally am not a California native resident. And so having moved here just before the fires, afterwards, it was very surprising to me to learn about these gaps in knowledge that we have surrounding urban fires of this scale. And so I sort of viewed this project as a way to take advantage of the resources and the scientific capacity that we have here at Caltech to really address these concerns as quickly as possible to improve public health policy down the road. And so, yeah.
Thank you all so much for sharing that. So we're going to start with Francois and Merritt, and we'll put a link in the Zoom chat to the first round of preliminary data that you've released. So Francois and Merritt, can you tell us briefly how you went about collecting and analyzing this data?
So before we even jump into how we got started and what type of sampling we did and the data, let's reorient ourselves. I think everyone on the webinar is probably familiar with it, but for broader context, let's just start with the fires and their situation. So here's a map showing the area around Los Angeles. The points show Los Angeles, Malibu, and Pasadena. You see the plumes. This was taken on January 9th. Right as the fires were ongoing. You can see the Pasadena, the Eaton fire, and the Palisades fire. You can see the plumes bringing everything from organic material to the heavy metals that the fires are releasing towards the ocean. And so the very peculiar nature of the fuel of the houses that have been burning in, especially in the Eaton fire, means that heavy metals will be present in the plume, transported by the winds, and deposited along the way. And the questions that we have, of course, is to what extent were heavy metals present? How much was deposited along the plume? To what distance? This is a question we've had many, many times. How far is far enough to be safe? And so safety is defined typically by the EPA clearance level. And so we wanted to know where are the heavy metals? Is cleaning effective? Those are our motivating questions. If we zoom in now to the Altadena and Pasadena region, this is something I shared already during the first webinar, but just for context, again, there are more than 7,000 houses that have been burnt, and over 90% of them were built before 1975, which means they are very, very likely to contain lead-based paint. What we did initially was just look at buildings around campus, and we saw high levels of lead on surfaces that had not been cleaned, and much lower levels of lead on surfaces that had been cleaned, but it meant that the lead had been transported at least all the way to Caltech. So as a follow-up, and because of a very high demand from the community for data, trying to bring some clarity on what should be recommended, we went around and we sampled many more houses, individual houses from people that volunteered, and Merritt will explain in detail where these houses were and how we did this work. And we took over 450 samples of what we call dust, which is the fine particles. You might not be able to see that particle, but it might have been deposited inside the house, on flat surfaces, on window sills, on the floor. We collected dust from clean and non-cleaned surfaces, trying to see what the difference in concentrations were. And we went back to the lab and we measured the concentration of heavy metals. We are focusing here on lead because it is one of the most, if not the most, risky element for health, the highest health concern. I'll pass it on to Merritt, who will tell you exactly what we have done and how we've done it.
Thanks. So I'll backtrack a little bit and get into more of the specifics about how we went about selecting locations and the actual methodology used in our sampling process. And so, like Francois mentioned, we started out with a very large volunteer pool of residents who offered their homes for testing. We ended up with a pool of around 400 volunteers, which, given the manpower and feasibility of coordinating sampling, we weren't able to visit all, but we distilled this volunteer pool down to 52 houses, covering as even and as wide of a spatial distribution as possible around the Pasadena and Altadena area, then expanding that pool to areas as far west, Dale, south as Highland Park, and then east as Sierra Madre. Francois, could you switch slides? Great. So like Francois mentioned, we also started our sampling at Caltech, the results for which were presented at the last webinar back in January. But then over the course of around February 5th through the 13th, we went around and sampled these 52 houses, collecting dust from windowsills and flat surfaces. And so on the left here, we have an image of sampling from a windowsill in a measured area that we would make on the spot, followed by on the right, an image of a flat surface that we measured with a predefined area outlined by the stencil there, keeping in mind that flat surfaces may also include floors. And so it's also important to mention too that these two images are representative of the fact that we also tried our best to sample indoor and outdoor samples, as outdoor samples would give us an indication of how much lead actually made it from the fire to the home, and then indoor samples giving us insight into how much lead actually made it into the home once it reached that location. Francois, could you? Thank you. And so in addition to those sets of samples, we also wanted to measure cleaned versus uncleaned surfaces. And so there is something that we want to make very clear in this presentation is that this subset of sampling was not a pre versus post cleaning grouping. Instead, we have samples of surfaces that were cleaned by the homeowners separately and samples from surfaces that were not cleaned. So this is not a pre versus post cleaning or a before and after cleaning sample set. And then just before we get into actually what the methodology for processing these samples are, I want to just quickly mention that we also, at each location we visited, sampled a little bit of tap water just to check to make sure that heavy metals were not making it into any sort of water distribution system. Francois, if you could. Thank you. So over these 52 houses, we collected around 300 samples, and then in conjunction with the Caltech samples, we ended up with a sample set of around 450. And so once all of these samples were collected, we then brought them back to the clean lab here at Caltech, where we had to do a little bit of pre-processing before we could put them into the instrument that actually measured our concentrations. So what this looked like was we took each vial that had a wet wipe sample that we collected during cleaning or during sampling. So you can see that at the very bottom of the vial in this image shown here. We then added a bit of acid to this vial to release these heavy metals from the dust on the wet wipe. Diluted or shook this vial then for about 2 hours before diluting with water to get it to a concentration that would be safe for our instrument to handle. So then if you could just go one more. Once we have all of these solutions processed and ready, we can put them into an instrument called an ICP-MS, which is an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer. Essentially what this instrument does is that for each element in the sample, it will count the number of atoms, or more specifically ions, to give us an indication of the concentration of that particular element in the sample. And because we're counting atoms, we can get this down to about a part per trillion level of lead concentration, which is what we're interested in. And so all of these samples, yeah, we can go ahead and I think, yeah.
So as Merritt said, we measured all the samples that we took. The sampling included outdoor surfaces, indoor surfaces. So let's start with the outdoor surfaces right here. This is a map showing the burnt structures are the very dark spots in the middle. The squares show the areas that we sampled, and the color is representative of the concentration of lead according to this scale right here. So green would be very little lead, well below the EPA limit, all the way to orange. Dark orange would be close to the EPA limit, and then anything that's above the floor limit from the EPA, which is 50 microgram per square meter, would be in bright red. Everything that's above the windowsill limit is in dark red. We've applied those limits to outdoor surfaces, even though they don't necessarily apply to outdoor surfaces, but just as an indication. What the map shows is that everywhere in Pasadena and along the Plume Trail, we have very high concentrations of lead on outdoor surfaces, which means that the lead that was released by the fire was carried very large distances all the way, at least we've measured all the way to 7 miles along the fire plume, and we still see the same elevated amount of lead. Now, this is what is outside. What is much more of a concern is what makes it inside the houses. So we can move to indoor surfaces. we're displaying two maps. On the left is surfaces that had not been cleaned. On the right, surfaces that had been cleaned. And we're going to start with window sills, because window sills and flat surfaces and tables and floors have different EPA limit. So here the limit from the EPA recommendation is 400 microgram per square meter of lead on the window sills. You can see on the left that before cleaning, a substantial number of houses, about a third of them, have above the EPA limit amount of lead on their window sills. After surfaces that had been cleaned, we see a much better situation with much less lead on the window sills. A few houses still have window sills with elevated lead above the EPA limit. And from this data, we can conclude that most, but not all, of the cleaned window sills have reduced level of lead below the EPA limit. Now, if we move further inside a home, we look at flat surfaces. So here we're meaning a table, a coffee table, a nightstand, anything that is not immediately the window sill. Again, on the left is not cleaned, on the right is cleaned. The bright red is the EPA limit for floors and for floors. You can see that the majority of houses that we've visited, especially in the Pasadena area, have lead above the EPA limit on their floors and flat surfaces before cleaning. Surfaces that have been cleaned, the picture, you can see a lot more green. Only a few remaining points are above the EPA limit. Here, here, here. It seems to be rather random. And what it indicates is that most of the time, cleaning is effective and brings back the lead levels below the EPA limit, but it is not all the time. It is not a certainty that the cleaning will work. We are not sure what makes the difference yet, but this is what the data indicates. Now, if we go into a little bit more detail and we look at lead concentration on the vertical axis versus distance from a window, this is a way for us to assess how far things make it inside the house. So WS here is window sill. Now this is going to be less than a meter away from the window, 1 to 2 meters away from a window, 2 to 5 meters away, more than 5 meters away. And let's start with non-cleaned surfaces. Here are the data. Each point is a sample that we have taken and measured. The red bar, the bright red and the dark red are the EPA limit for floors and window sills. And you can see that on surfaces that we sampled that had not been cleaned, a very large number of them fall above the EPA limit, like we have seen on the previous maps. Some of them, because this is a logarithmic scale, every step here is a factor of 10. Some of them are above the EPA limit by almost a factor of 1,000. I want to emphasize that for a couple of points, the 3 points here, we have been able to associate the photo that we took to the presence of soldered window panes, where the soldering is done with lead. So these 3 very high points there are clearly associated not to the fire, but to some pre-existing lead in the house. For all of the other points, we were not able to identify any other source than the fire. So yes, we have to think that the lead is coming from the fire. The main thing to take from this figure is that if you're within a meter of a window sill, there is about 10 times more lead than if you are more than a meter away from the window. Now, how does it look after on surfaces that have been cleaned? You can see that all of the data that we have acquired is plotting at a much lower position. Most of the points are below the EPA limit, but not all of the points. Some of them still fall above the EPA limit. On average, clean surfaces have 30 to 10 times less lead than unclean surfaces. And I'll give it back to Merritt for the tap water.
Each house that we visited, we took a small sample of tap water to check to make sure that lead in particular was not making its way into the water distribution system. And so as we can see on the map here indicating all of the lead or all of the tap water samples that we collected, all of them remain below the EPA action level of 10 nanograms per milliliter. So that is very encouraging to see.
All right, and before we pass it on to the next speaker, just to wrap up, the data that we've acquired in houses from volunteers, and we thank the people that volunteered their houses. This would not have been possible without them. the data that we've acquired shows that lead has been transported by the fire, lead and other heavy metals. There is significant contamination, even in Highland Park, which is 7 miles away. We find that unclean surfaces have most of the time above the EPA limit levels of lead, and clean surfaces have 90% of the time below the EPA limit level of lead, which is good. It indicates that cleaning is absolutely necessary. Most of the time it is effective, not all the time. The most at risk surfaces will be the ones close to a window, where there is about 10 times more lead than away from a window. And the good news is that the tap water system does not seem to have been impacted by the fire.
Thank you so much, Francois and Merritt. We've had a few questions about what cleaning means. Can you tell us how you're defining cleaning?
Yeah, cleaning can be anything from the owner of the house had professional remediation done to the owner of the house just used a wet wipe to wipe surfaces. Professional remediation is just a very extensive version of wet wiping.
Thank you. And do you have any data on other toxic metals other than lead?
We have also data on cadmium, arsenic, chromium, all the heavy metals that people are concerned about. We only presented the lead because lead is much more enriched because of the nature of the fire, because of the lead present in the houses. We see similar patterns for other toxic metals like cadmium and chromium and arsenic, but the amount of the element present is much less, 100 times less on average. So the main concern is definitely lead.
Okay, thank you so much, Francois and Merritt. So Isaac, let's turn to you. Your team was using the same technique to analyze samples, but you were looking at ash and not the dust or fine particles that Francois's team was looking at. So can you define the difference between ash and particles and tell us where you found it?
That's correct. We did use the same ICP-MS technique in the Tissot lab with the help of his amazing postdoc, Theo, to measure the concentration of lead in the ashes from the Eaton fire. And then before I go a little bit further, I do want to, at this time, acknowledge the rest of the science team and the sampling team that has been supporting this study on the ashes from the Eaton fire. And so, like you mentioned, let me change this slide. Yeah, so like you mentioned, the subject of our study was the ashes from the fire. And ash is defined as the coarse residue from incomplete combustion of wildland vegetation and urban infrastructure. This is different from dust, which is a mix of fine ash particles, soot, and aerosols. And so this distinction is important because we discovered that they don't behave the same way. And we collected samples of ashes from outdoor street surfaces between January 14th and the 25th around the wildland and urban burn scar and in areas in the southwestern wind direction. These ashes can be categorized in 3 distinct sources, the first of which was ashes from the urban fire scar in Altadena, where there was a high density of damaged structures, shown here in the map in the blue color for ashes from the urban fire. The second type of ashes that we collected were ashes from the wildland fire scar along the periphery of the urban interface with the San Gabriel mountain wildlands, shown here on the map in orange. And then the third type of ashes we collected were the ones that were blown outside of the fire perimeter, shown here in pink. And we targeted the ashes along this northeast to southwest trending axis to try to understand how far ashes from the urban fire specifically may have been distributed by the Santa Ana winds. And today I'll be sharing results for lead and asbestos in the ash samples that we collected. For lead, the ashes were grinded and sieved before being dissolved in acid in a similar technique that Merritt just described. Before the individual lead atoms in the ashes were counted with the ICP-MS technique. For asbestos, we selected a subset of our ash samples to send to a professional service lab that specializes in asbestos testing. That service lab uses polarized light microscopy and transmission electron microscopy which has detection limits down to 0.1% of asbestos in a sample.
All right, so do you want to expand on what you found and the concentrations that you found within the ash?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the results for lead. In 40 samples of ashes we collected from around Altadena, Pasadena, Sierra Madre, and La Cañada Flint Ridge. This map here shows the ICP-MS measurements of the amount of micrograms of lead per gram of ash that we collected. The color of each point on the map here represents a gradient from low concentration in a white color to a high concentration in the dark purple colors. And overall, we found that the concentration of lead in the ashes from the wildland burn scar had much lower lead than ashes from the urban burn scar in the Altadena area, where there was a higher density of damaged structures. The urban fire ashes had over 300 micrograms of lead per gram of ash, while the wildland fire ashes had lead levels that were between 10 to 30 micrograms of lead per gram of ash, which was more similar to unpolluted soils that we also sampled from the Ian Canyon. The yellow arrow here shows the direction of the winds that followed a northeast to southwest trending axis, and the ashes southwest of the urban burn zone in Altadena still had high lead concentrations, even though they were sampled from outside of the fire perimeter. The concentration of lead in the ashes seems to be much lower away outside of this northeast to southwest trending axis. So the ashes we collected towards the east in Sierra Madre and towards the west in La Cañada Flint Ridge had lower lead concentrations. And so this is seen by that steep drop in the lead concentration in those samples. And it was only up to about like 5 miles southwest of the Altadena burn scar, where we saw that steep drop off in the concentration of lead in the ashes. And the next map that I'm going to show is an interpolation map of the lead concentration in ash, which is meant to help viewers visualize this pattern that I'm describing. But as a disclaimer, please only use this map for visualization purposes of this pattern, and it's not meant to be used to assess risk. So again, this map here outlines that path of the ashes with a high concentration of lead that came from the urban burn zone in Altadena along that northeast to southwest trending axis, which follows that wind direction that occurred during the Ian fire. However, it's also important to note that there are no regulatory thresholds for ashes specifically, like there may be for other types of samples.
Thanks so much, Isaac. And I know you mentioned something that a lot of folks are worried about, which is asbestos. Can you talk a bit about the difficulty in measuring asbestos and the progress that you've made so far?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that asbestos can be challenging to detect in ashes because the high heat from fires can consume or degrade asbestos into smaller fragments. And that's why we decided to send some of our ashes that we collected to a professional service lab that specializes in asbestos quantification methods. We got our results back just this week that found no asbestos detected in any of the ashes that we submitted. And again, this lab uses polarized light microscopy and transmission electron microscopy with Environmental Protection Agency certified procedures that have detection limits down to 0.1% of the sample. And so this suggests that the ashes from the outdoor street surfaces where we sampled didn't have any asbestos in them. But we can't extend this interpretation to any other types of samples like dust, debris, or aerosols because we didn't test for those types of samples. And my last slide that I have here summarizes the key takeaways from our study to characterize lead and asbestos in the ashes collected from the urban and wildland fire. We found low levels of lead in the ashes from the wildland fire, but abnormal levels of lead in ashes from the urban fire in Altadena. And it was the winds that were blowing along that northeast to southwest trending axis that transported ashes with the high lead levels from the urban fire in Altadena at least 5 miles southwest of the burn scar perimeter. After that, it seemed like the lead levels seemed to drop off. And so the last thing that we discovered was that in the samples of ashes we collected, there was no asbestos detected in any of them.
Thank you so much, Isaac, for sharing your findings. All right, and now last but not least, we will go to Christine O'Connell. So Christine, thank you for joining us from Chapman University. And so your samples are of the soil outside of homes. Let's just start off, where were these homes? How many did you go to? How did you examine the data and what did you find?
Yeah, so thank you, Lori. As you said, these results differ from the speakers who you just heard from because instead of looking at directly deposited ash or dust directly from the fire, our team is particularly interested in what's integrating into surface soils. So the data I'll be presenting today looks at lead concentrations in surface soils of gardens, lawns, and yards. And before I talk to you about the methods, I want to just kind of shout out that this is a really large interdisciplinary team of geoscientists, engineers, ecologists, fire scientists, and we feel really fortunate to be collaborating with a bunch of groups who have previous experience with wildland-urban interface fires, including the Borch Lab at Colorado State, the Fendorf Lab at Stanford, the Hannigan Lab at University of Nevada, Reno, and then kind of our sub-team includes folks who have worked on fires, folks who have worked on kind of agroecology and agricultural metal uptake and heavy metal loading from other things like mining tailings. And of course, also thank you to all the undergraduates who have made all this data collection possible. Okay, so as you mentioned, our core question is, what contaminants are on residential soils in and around the Eaton fire? What forms are they in? What might be coming off of them? And what are the present and longer term risks? So these are some really large questions that are going to involve longitudinal studies, will require many different dependent variables and different types of measurements. But today I'm going to present kind of the initial survey results that we've collected using a different kind of technique from what you've heard about in the last few presentations. Instead of using ICP methods, we're going to present data that was taken using a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer. We're going to call this an XRF analyzer. So the way these analyzers work is they send out a burst of X-rays towards a sample, a material, whatever you want to measure, and they excite the atoms in that sample. Those atoms, as they get excited, send back fluorescence, and the analyzer can use that fluorescence to kind of calculate what materials and what elements are present in that sample. So a huge benefit of an XRF analyzer approach is that you get results very fast and you can take many of them. Kind of what you're giving up in that trade-off is that your precision at low concentrations isn't as strong. So for that reason, we're really only presenting lead results because lead is present in high enough concentrations that even though we're using a kind of less precise survey data method, we're really confident in the lead results. For metals that are present at much lower concentrations, this kind of baseline extensive survey data probably isn't as valuable of an approach. So, and this is a photo of not the Eden fire, just because we wanted to protect everyone's privacy, but this is kind of what this technique looks like out in the field. You point the analyzer at something, you measure something, you got your data. All right, so what did we do in and around the Eden fire? So we have followed 20 residential properties, 10 that have burned structures and 10 that do not have burned structures on the property. And for every visit to those properties, we've taken between 10 and 50 scans per site per visit. The reason that the number of scans and observations varies is we're only looking at garden, lawn, and yard soils. So it sort of depends on how big the lawn or garden is of those properties. So how we've been approaching this is when we get to a residential space, we sort of look for areas that have intact soil, yards, gardens, lawns, etc. We roughly split them up into quadrants, and then we take a sample in the middle of each quadrant. So this is just an example, but we would do the same thing in this patch of yard over here, etc. I'll say that all of these unburned homes are much closer to the burn zone than the data sets you just saw. The furthest home that we looked at was less than 3 kilometers away from the southern border of the burn zone. So this sampling is ongoing. It's over a longer time period than the data you just looked at. We began the first week of February, and the most recent data that you'll see was taken this week. We have quite a bit of ongoing work, which I think I'll talk about at the end, right before the Q&A. But like I said, this XRF data, we see this as sort of the first pass baseline data that allows us to get a sense of the overall patterns and variability across and within residential properties. And then we're going to follow that up with sampling over time across depths, work looking at the mobility and bioaccessibility of these different species of metals, and that's using ICP methodology, et cetera. All right, Lori, do you want me to dive into the results, or do you have any clarifying questions?
Go for it, Christine.
Okay, sounds great. So the data that I'm going to show here represents about 430 samples we took from only surface soils. And I'm going to have 3 key takeaways I'd like to communicate out. The first key takeaway is that lead in the surface soils of gardens, lawns, and yards in our data set exceeded the California recommendation for residential soils in about 1/3 of our observations and exceeded the EPA limit in about 7% of observations. So let me show you that data. First, I'm going to show you this more difficult to read graph. So what we're looking at here on the x-axis is the concentration of lead, Pb, in parts per million. On the y-axis, these are what's called a density plot. It kind of shows us where the data points are concentrated. You can think of it as a smoothed out histogram or bar plot. So the y-axis is a kind of measure of probability. So before I dig into what the graph is showing us, I'll just note that across our 431 samples, we had 5 really large outliers, which I'm not cutting from this data set, but I'm going to show you a zoomed in version of the graph that's just a little bit easier to read. Okay, so here's our zoomed in version that goes from 0 to 400 parts per million. There's 2 kind of density plots and 4 lines I'd like to draw your attention to. So the first thing I'll have you note is that there's 2 colors on this graph. The blue color is all of our observations from properties, from surface soils on properties that had no damaged or burned structures. The orange density plot is our observations from surface soils, from soils themselves on properties that did have a burned structure. So we're going to call these burned and no damage, or burned and unburned plots, or sorry, properties. So the first thing I'll just have you note is that there's 2 dashed lines. This first dashed line is located at 80 parts per million. That's the California recommendation level for lead concentration in residential soils. So this is a recommendation, not a requirement or limit. The second line I'll have you note is the EPA standard limit for lead concentrations in residential soils. That's at 200. The 2 colored lines are the mean concentration in our samples. So these samples from burned properties had a mean of about 93 parts per million of lead, and the samples from unburned properties had a mean of about 80 parts per million of lead. So that's right on that California limit, hence the overlapping lines. And our sample size was a little bit uneven, but we felt like we had a pretty good number. We had about 230 samples from burned properties and a little under 200 samples from unburned properties. So I'd like to note 2 things about this before I move on to our next key result. The first is that by definition, all of these data are from soils that are not slated to be removed during the FEMA/Army Corps of Engineer debris removal. We only tested soils that were outside of the debris shadow. So none of these soils would be scraped during the kind of conventional debris removal process that you might have read about in the news, in which the top 6 inches of soil are slated to be removed directly underneath fallen debris. These are kind of the remaining yard and garden soils that will remain on your property if you have a burned structure that's having debris removal conducted by the Army Corps of Engineers. The second thing I'll note is just these proportions. So they're roughly similar, but we did see elevated lead on properties that had burned structures in comparison to unburned structures. So the proportion of observations that were above that California recommendation of 80 parts per million was about 38%. If there was a burned structure on your property, more like 34% if you didn't have a burned structure on your property. And the numbers were also a little bit elevated for that EPA limit of 200 parts per million. So about a little bit under 8% of our observations on burned properties are above that marker, and more like 7.5% or above that marker on unburned properties. So our second major key result that we'd like you to take away from these data is that there is substantial variation in lead, both within and across properties in surface soils. So again, this is a massively zoomed out figure. You can see those same 5 outliers I mentioned before. I'm not cutting them from the data set, but I'm going to zoom in. So this is a zoomed in plot in which there's a box and whiskers plot associated with each property that we visited. Any plot colored in orange is a burned plot where there was a burned structure on the property. Any plot colored in blue is a plot, a residence in which there were no damaged or burned structures. So what you're looking at here is just each of these bar plots goes with a house, a property, and then the y-axis is the concentration of lead in these surface soils. You have that EPA 200 parts per million limit right here, and that 80 part per million California recommendation right here. So the first thing I'll have you note is just that there's a lot of variability, both within a property and across a property. So you can see that some of these properties both have higher and lower means, even within the collection of homes that are burned or unburned. And within a given home, within the yard of a given home, there are some areas in which we read much higher lead levels than not. So we have a lot of ongoing work trying to think through why. I'll point out a few of our kind of more preliminary results here. So the first thing I want to note is these data are not represented in any of the means or graphs I showed you, but because they're kind of a very unique case, which I'll explain in a second. So one thing I'll note is that we're sort of discovering, and we've learned from other wildland-urban interface fires, that there's potentially a lot of importance to whether or not you have what we're calling a point source of material on your yard that wasn't part of your home. So if something burned down in your garden or yard, think things like a heater, an electric or gas fire pit, a grill or barbecue, or if they melted, those probably aren't going to be on your mind as sort of like the core part of the debris that you need to be thinking about. But we have been opportunistically taking samples immediately adjacent in the soils right around things like your barbecue, your fire pit, your portable heater by your picnic table, stuff like that. And we see some really, really high numbers. So not always, but often enough. So if you live on a property in which you had fire damage to one of these kind of like smaller pieces of debris, you might potentially take care to kind of proactively remove the soils right around that item. The other thing I'll note is that the unburned home in this data set ranged from homes that are on blocks with multiple burned houses all the way to homes that are about 3 kilometers away from the burn zone edge. But we didn't immediately see a correlation between lead concentrations making it into soil and distance to the closest burn property. That's sort of in keeping with what we just learned from the last 3 speakers. So we weren't incredibly surprised by this finding just because we know the smoke plume moved lead very far. We're continuing to investigate this dynamic. And again, we'll sort of point out that kind of one of the features of our soils data set is that there's a lot of heterogeneity. Okay, our third core finding that we want people to take away, and this one's a little more technical, so I'll try to make sure that I explain the context, is that fine soil particulates are enriched in lead in comparison to bulk soil samples. So what I mean by that is soil has particulates in it that are of all different diameters. And in general, these fine soil particulates, which we're going to define here as less than or equal to 250 microns in size, are the soil particles that are more mobile, they're more ingestible. These are the particles that can electrostatically stick to skin, food, clothing, hair, pet hair, and you might not necessarily notice them. These are also the particle size at which, like, you don't really notice it inside of your mouth the way you would with a larger piece of soil, piece of sand, etc. So these fine soil particles we think of as sort of the readily ingestible soil particles that are actually like making it into your digestive system and then potentially allowing that lead to be mobilized into your bloodstream. So what we've found, we took 25 bulk soil samples from across these homes and we brought them back to the lab. What you're looking at here is a combo of bars from each of the 25 bulk soil samples We dried them, measured them again in the lab for lead concentration, which here is shown on a log scale because we have some big outliers we didn't want to cut or not show to you guys. And then we send those bulk samples through a series of sieves until we end up with only the very fine soil particulates. So again, these are the particulates that can stick to your hands, stick to your clothes, more easily get into your mouth. And then we measured the lead concentration in only those fine samples. Again, California recommendation limit of 80 parts per million, EPA requirement in residential soils of 200 parts per million. So soil particulates that are these fines, these 250 microns in size or smaller, were on average enriched by 61% in lead in comparison to the bulk surface soil samples. So why does it matter? I guess one of our core takeaways is that the soils around you, these fine particulates, your bulk measurement that you might get out of testing isn't necessarily going to represent what you, your child, or your pet might be ingesting. So here, kind of the general interventions that you can make is just to limit your exposure to these very fine particulates, which again, you're not necessarily visually seeing or feeling inside of your mouth. Again, the kind of standard ways to mitigate your exposure is hand washing, frequent hand washing, removing shoes on your way indoors. So it's just trying to limit how much of this dust gets into your house where you're eating food, having your kid play on the floor, sitting on the ground, etc. And using wet cleaning methods as opposed to dry sweeping, especially in the areas right around doorways and windowsills. Okay, Lori, do you have a follow-up or should I go to our recommendations?
Yeah, so for the sake of time, maybe if you could just really briefly go over the recommendations and then we'll need to move to audience Q&A.
Great. Yeah, so our recommendations, our data suggests that soils in and around the Eden Fire could be a source of lead above recommended levels, and we are advocating for widespread soil testing if possible. Soil should be tested. Your lead levels might vary between homes across a single yard. It can be a high level outside of the debris footprint of your burned home if you have a burned home on your property. If you're doing this testing yourself, we advocate for using a composite surface sample, which means only bother getting the top centimeter or two of your soils, walking around your yard, getting a bunch of samples at once, putting it into the same bag or jar, kind of mixing it all together. That'll kind of get you with fewer samples, kind of more holistic composite of what might be going on in your yard. And if your lead levels are elevated above that EPA limit, advocate for soil removal and replacement. And my mitigation strategies, I think we're talking about as a group. So I'm happy to kick us back to Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your results, Christine. Thank you everyone who shared results. So we've received so many questions from the audience, so we'll take about 15 minutes to answer some of those. And we'll try to get through a bunch, so please keep your answers brief. So the first question is, what can I do to test for lead and the presence of other chemicals in the house or the soil, or request testing for somewhere like my child's school?
Yeah, maybe I can take that one. There are multiple avenues. If you're in a zone where you think your insurance is going to cover for this kind of thing, you should definitely ask your insurance. If not, there are some tests, lead tests that you can buy. The EPA recommends 3 of them. One of them is the lead check test, which is just a little stick that you take and wipe a surface, and if it has more than a few microgram of lead on the surface, it will turn bright red. So those are steps you can take. And the second part of the question was about schools, right?
Yeah, requesting testing.
Yeah, I think because of the sensitivity of kids to lead, and again, there is no safe level of lead for kids. Any lead that they ingest will result in a diminished development of the brain. It is very important to coordinate with your school, make sure that they have cleaned properly, that they have tested. It should be a safe environment for the children.
Thanks so much, Francois. This next one, I think, Christine, maybe you can answer. It's kind of a bunch of questions in one. So how long does lead in soil last, and how should we be thinking about edible vegetation growing in this soil, like our fruit trees or our gardens, so on like that?
Yeah, great question. So maybe I'll start by just saying that I believe we're going to put a link in the chat to some work that was done by the UC Cooperative Extension Group in Sonoma County after the Tubbs fire in 2017, in which there was also a lot of concern about kind of like edible produce in the immediate downwind and ash affected areas of the fire. So I think we're putting a link in the chat to kind of the public outreach guidance and data from that, which has been really helpful. Broadly, what they found is that the fruits and vegetables that received immediate ash input were okay to consume after washing. Kind of the next level of washing might be with a dilute vinegar and water mix, which can potentially mobilize some of these kind of like contaminants on the surfaces. But yeah, broadly, these are considered safe to eat, which I know has been in a lot of people's mind. And sorry, the other part of the question was, how long does this stuff stick around?
How long does it persist in soil? Yeah.
Yeah, really great question. And I'll say there's a lot of unknowns. So how long these sorts of contaminants can stay in soil is going to depend on the form of the contaminant, the speciation of that metal, aspects of soil hydrology, kind of the soil science of the different particulates in soil. So some soils are more sticky to metals than others. Our soils around here aren't going to get a ton of rainfall as well, which can potentially kind of influence mobilization of these sorts of metals. So that's ongoing work that our team and our collaborative teams are very interested in. We'll be sampling these soils for a full year from now, so until about a year and 2 months after the Eaton fire, and hopefully in an ongoing fashion, or hopefully we'll find that all the metal is gone. We don't need to keep sampling. But yeah, I think there's some major open questions. But I think it's fair to say it's more on the orders of months to years, not days to weeks. We're 2 months into the sampling. We have not seen a statistically significant reduction in these lead levels. We've done some limited sampling in the immediate wake of a rainfall, and we did not find a drop in lead levels. So we're anticipating some level of persistence.
Thank you, Christine. So there's been a lot of questions about the difference between soft surfaces and hard surfaces, such as couches versus windowsills. So Francois and Merritt, did you make any measurements on soft surfaces, and would there be differences between the data that you'd collect?
Yeah, we did not measure soft surfaces because of the difficulty of quantifying what is the surface area that we would be testing. This is a question I don't have the answer to, how to clean the soft surfaces, how to test the soft surfaces. We only did hard surfaces.
Thank you. Another question, do homes with elevated levels need a special cleaning process just for lead, or can lead be cleaned along with ash and other contaminants?
Yeah, I can take this one. It depends what you are referring to when you say cleaning of other contaminants. Some contaminants like ash, you can vacuum away. That will not remove the lead. Lead needs a wet wiping approach, which remediation companies are trained to do, but it does require to wipe every single surface in the house.
All right, moving on to our next question. So we've had some days of rain in Los Angeles after the fires, and how does the rain affect the levels of lead in the soils? Does it, help wash down outdoor surfaces? If someone can comment on that.
So I think I alluded to this before, but one of our core hypotheses is that, in general, we anticipate that rainfall would indeed flush some of these materials out of soil systems, which kind of brings up a whole host of questions about kind of marine health, which I won't get into here. But I'll say that in our kind of immediate data collection, we are not seeing kind of measurable drop in soil lead levels in these soil surfaces, which doesn't mean that lead isn't leaving the system. It just means there's still enough sticking around that it's measurably there. And there's so much heterogeneity in soil systems that can kind of swamp some of these signals. So yeah, I think that rainfall is a really important dynamic on a longer time scale, but not necessarily in these few weeks and months. And I think there's going to be a question about this later, but for that reason, most of our remediation suggestions are not necessarily about flushing soil away, but more about managing the soils that are on your property.
Yeah, Christine, do you want to elaborate a little bit more on the potential soil remediation interventions?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for asking. So I think the kind of tried and true, if you have contaminated soils, the sort of tried and true classic remediation is removing them and replacing them with new soils. That's probably not going to be feasible for a lot of people. And I think one challenge is that while we've routinely measured soils to be above that EPA limit, it's only about 7% of all of our observations, and they're not concentrated on only certain properties. So across your yard, you might have patches of soil that kind of like do break that 200 part per million barrier, but broadly, the kind of moving average of the soil that you or your children or your pets interact with are below that level. So for that reason, some kind of very practical interventions that the average person can make, depending on your budget, are things like if you grow food in a raised bed, so this is like a smaller space that might be cheaper to just replace that soil, like that's probably a low-hanging fruit intervention. So replacing soil in places where you grow food and grow produce, especially if you grow root vegetables. Kind of the second major intervention is there's some data, not from here in the Eden fire, but from other fires, that organic material can bind some of these metal contaminants. So that could look like adding compost to your soil, adding mulch to your soil, things like that. You can, of course, remove soil from your yard personally, just with a shovel, etc. And then finally, this is also kind of in the realm of not data specifically from the Eden fire, but some other data is that there are kind of phytoremediation interventions that you can take, like planting species of plants that are really good at taking up heavy metals. Some of the classic examples are sunflowers, cilantro. If you do plant cilantro, don't eat it. You let it take up heavy metals and then you discard the plant. So I'll say just personally, I live less than a mile downwind. We did do professional remediation inside of our home. Outside of our home, we're mostly implementing mitigation strategies to kind of like limit our ingestion of these fine soil particulates, hand washing, shoes off in the house, wet mopping around the doors. But in our yard, we're putting down a new layer of mulch. And we planted a bunch of native plants. Finally, I think something that a lot of people might want to consider is speaking with their doctors, pediatricians, or veterinarians about having vulnerable people in the household have their lead blood tests done on some recurring schedule.
Thanks so much. So we've had so many questions. I'm going to take us just a little over time to 12:05 Pacific. So 3 more questions. The first is for wet wiping, are there specific cleaners or solutions that are needed to clean lead, or does just water work?
Yeah, all the testing we've done was just with water. So water will mobilize a lot of the lead during the wet wiping. The main thing I've been made aware of is some cleaners you don't want to use on a fire affected surface because it might react with other compounds. Like I've read that vinegar could react with some of the compounds. So I would recommend water as a first pass, and then checking if lead is still there.
Thank you. And how are you all thinking about recontamination as the debris cleanup is continuing and wind might be remobilizing debris from the fire?
Yeah, this one is a good question as well. There's a risk of recontamination during the debris removal because debris removal is going to generate some fine particles and put them in the air. There is an effort, real-time monitoring effort by some of the Caltech professors and teams. It's called Phoenix efforts. If this can be put in the chat, if not, I will put it in the chat. That will tell you what is the air quality, so amount of particles. after the debris removal will be completed, we will do a follow-up study, the same sort of sampling that we did to hopefully the same houses or nearby, to assess what remains in the environment now that everything is supposed to have been removed. But this will be taking place in a few months only.
Great, thank you so much. And our final question for Christine and Francois, how are you each thinking about your own situation with, kids playing in the backyard or potentially moving back to your houses?
So, our home, as I mentioned, is in the ash plume, not in the burn zone itself. So we were out of our home until 2 weeks ago. We were lucky enough to be able to do professional remediation inside of our home. We did return. I will say my daughter went to the pediatrician yesterday to get her blood tested, and our dog is going to the vet tomorrow to get his blood tested. So maybe our approach has been sort of like trust but verify, or cautiously proceed. We are letting her play in the backyard. That makes me a little nervous, but you have to balance your kids' happiness a bit too. I think we're hopefully going to stay nimble and pivot if anything starts to come back a little wonky. Francois, I don't know what you're thinking.
Our situation is very different. Our house is very far deep in the fire zone and was surrounded by structures that were all burnt. It is one of the last houses on the neighborhood. So it has suffered the heavy metal contamination, but also fire and heat damage, which makes the situation a little tricky because it means that the lead was not just deposited on the exposed surfaces, but also inside the walls. So for us, remediation might require stripping down the house to the studs to clean the studs and then rebuild from there, or just demolishing entirely the house and removing it. The second part of the question was about how safe would we feel returning after the debris removal. After everything has been, if you remove the first 6 inches of soil, if you remove the ash, if you remove the hazardous material, I would feel after testing that everything is clean, comfortable returning, because once you remove the lead, it's no longer there. The most dangerous is being exposed to it, not knowing it, not removing it. But this will take a very long time for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about, your personal stories as well. So we've received so many questions that we won't be able to get to today, but we will follow up. And yeah, so that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us and for submitting questions. And thank you to our panelists for your hard work in helping us understand the impacts of these fires on the community. Please save the date for the next Conversations webinar, which will be on May 2nd. And we will be talking about air quality measurements, which many of you wrote in with questions about, so hopefully we can get those answered. We also wanted to mention that the LA County Department of Public Health is holding a virtual town hall on post-fire soil and water testing at 6 p.m. today. And there will be a link in the chat to that, or you can find a recording on their YouTube page afterwards. And finally, a recording of this webinar will be available on the Caltech Science Exchange, where you can go for more insights from researchers on fire-related topics. So you can visit scienceexchange.caltech.edu/fires. Thank you all so much for joining us.